So last week, the fighting on Reach went from scattered engagements across the Vieri continent to Operation Uppercut, which saw UNSC forces leading a raid against Covenant forces in orbit. Well, this week, things really pick up as Covenant forces launch massive assaults across the planet against major civilian population centers, most notably the city of New Alexandria. So today, let's discuss the Siege of New Alexandria. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. So last week we discussed the fighting on the Vieri continent and Operation Uppercut, which saw Covenant forces start the week with scattered fighting as they sort of built an army in secret, and ended with a brazen UNSC assault against a Covenant supercarrier in orbit. An assault that was successful, but saw a tsunami of Covenant warships start arriving in the Epsilon Eridani system, home to the world of Reach. This meant that Reach was now fully under siege by Covenant forces, and while that arrival started on the 14th, by the 18th, sieges were beginning across major population centers all over Reach. The fighting in New Alexandria began on August 18th when Covenant forces, led by brute factions, arrived at the major city of New Alexandria. Now, the situation in orbit had gotten pretty dicey in between the 14th and the 18th. The much larger Covenant force had stretched the UNSC fleet in orbit pretty thin, forcing UNSC warships to the far corners of the Epsilon Eridani system in an effort to counter the much larger Covenant naval presence. As a result of the UNSC fleet being stretched so thin, the Covenant were able to involve large capital ships basically directly in ground operations. As a result, the assault on New Alexandria was actually directly supported from the air by a number of Covenant corvettes, which could provide easy fire support for the ground forces, which quickly began moving street to street and house to house in an effort to wipe out the civilian populations in that area. Now, following the pattern that happens most frequently with these Covenant invasions, things have shifted now from a more clandestine state where Covenant forces are carrying out small incursions in rural areas to a massive assault that is predominantly viewed as an assault on the civilian population. As such, the UNSC's objectives have gone from repelling Covenant forces to simply holding them off long enough for civilian evacuations to be carried out, which is exactly what's happening in New Alexandria. The effort has shifted from repelling the Covenant force to simply holding them back while the civilian population attempts to flee the system. However, that's become rather difficult in this population center because, as I mentioned, there are Covenant corvettes basically looming over the city, making it nearly impossible for civilian transports to actually evacuate the city. Furthermore, Covenant ground forces are still sweeping building to building and house to house, and facing increasingly desperate resistance from UNSC forces that are finding themselves pinned into more and more desperate situations. The original plan was to attempt to evacuate civilians from the top of Traxxas Tower. However, this tower was destroyed by Covenant forces right around the time that Noble 6 arrived in the city. As a result, the evacuation effort shifted to the New Alexandria Spaceport, which makes sense. There's a large piece of infrastructure there for handling large amounts of civilian traffic off the world, so that's a pretty obvious choice. However, looming over the spaceport were those Covenant corvettes, making it nearly impossible for any large civilian transport to successfully flee. They would all simply be shot down while they attempted to evacuate. On top of that, Covenant forces were closing in on the spaceport. Realizing that a massive evacuation operation was being carried out there, it had become a key target for the Covenant strike force. As a result, UNSC forces shifted their efforts not necessarily to protecting the spaceport, but instead to liberating a number of surface-to-air missile sites around the city so that they could engage the Covenant corvettes and at least allow the transports that had already been loaded to evacuate the area. This effort was ultimately successful thanks to the help of Noble 6, and on August 23rd, these UNSC transports were able to slip away after the Covenant corvettes were temporarily neutralized. However, this would only be a little bit of good news in the string of bad news that was in store for New Alexandria, because later that day, on the evening of the 23rd of August, Covenant battle cruisers arrived over the city and began the process of glassing this major population center. Now, UNSC forces still in the city, operating out of Olympus Tower under the direction of the Office of Naval Intelligence, which had a headquarters in that building, attempted to mount the best resistance they could, trying to knock out Covenant jammers that had been set up around the city. Now, this was somewhat successful, but didn't really do much in delaying the progress the Covenant battlecruisers were making in basically slagging the entire city. By the end of the 23rd, most of the city was left in ruins, and by the 26th, any UNSC forces in New Alexandria had been forced to abandon their positions, with the city having been completely destroyed. Now, this is not just New Alexandria, by the way. This process is basically happening simultaneously at every major population center across Reach. The battle is very quickly turning in favor of the Covenant, and with things starting to turn south in orbit as well, as UNSC forces find themselves being forced into situations where they're outnumbered by far superior Covenant warships, the whole playing field on Reach is now skewing more and more in favor of the Covenant. By the end of this week, the Battle of Reach's tragic conclusion is looking more and more imminent as the city of New Alexandria falls, and the glassing of the planet slowly begins. But all of this actually started in late July, when the Covenant began small incursion attacks into the area around Reach, mainly striking communications infrastructure, most notably the Visegrad Relay. If you'd like to learn about the battle at the Visegrad Relay, the first Covenant incursion onto Reach, I'll leave a link up here to my video on that. And I'd like you to let me know down in the comments whether you think it makes sense for the UNSC to disperse their forces across the Epsilon Eridani system to attempt to protect the other worlds there, or should they have just focused their naval forces around Reach to prevent Covenant, warships from being able to slip through to the surface and abandon the rest of the system to the Covenant? Do you think that would have helped at all? At the end of the day, the UNSC Navy is nothing compared to the Covenant Navy, and all the Covenant would have to do is keep pumping ships and materials and resources into the Epsilon Eridani system to eventually overwhelm the defenders of Reach. And if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover in Halo, Star Wars, or anywhere else in science fiction, you can let me know down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon to get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.